Hello, everybody, and welcome to InfoSec and the Technology Showcase. This session is specifically around the myth-busting associated with XDR, EDR, and MDR. We will find out what they all mean and what they mean to you. On the panel today, we have Rob Demain, CEO and founder of E2E Assure. We have Adam Gwinnett, CTO and CISO at 923 Limited and former head of cybersecurity at the Met Police. And finally, we have Sarah Armstrong-Smith, Chief Security Advisor for Microsoft. Welcome, everybody. So we find ourselves in a situation where ransomware is more and more prevalent. We find ourselves in a situation where budgetary cuts are still as challenging as they always used to be. We have cyber skill shortages, and we have many other pressures on the cybersecurity industry. Yet at the same time, we're expected to be able to detect and respond to attacks from criminal organizations who are repentant at attacking indiscriminate targets. And so we have to talk about the technology. So first of all, Sarah, thank you very much for joining us on this panel session. First really interesting question to you. Let's get straight in there. What is the difference between EDR, MDR, and XDR?
Mark, thank you. What a great question. And I'm absolutely delighted to be with you all today. So I think as an industry, we absolutely love our acronyms, don't we? So let's start with, let's just get rid of the acronyms. What are they? And then we'll get into what's the difference. So first of all, EDR stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. XDR actually stands for Extended Detection and Response, but we can't have another E, so hence why we have the X. And MDR is the Managed Detection and Response. So let's start with EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response. Well, the kind of clues in the name really, and it's really around protecting endpoints. So when we're talking about endpoints, we're talking about devices, potentially servers. And it's the intelligence that goes into, analyzing all the threats and signals that come from those endpoints. And in some cases, it may be automatically blocking known threats, or it might be sending signals to analysts for them to take further review and investigation. But the trouble is, and as you mentioned, when we talk about ransomware, we talk about these type of threats, it's very limited to endpoints. So if we're thinking about when we're thinking about these type of threats, it can originate through email, you can have compromised identities. We then have that lateral movement, elevation of privilege that comes associated with ransomware. So actually you need to look beyond just the endpoints, and that's really what the extended detection and response comes into play. So it's that ability to correlate and investigate beyond the endpoint into network servers and all of those things together. And really what we're talking about, it really comes down to time is of the essence. So we're probably seeing that potentially companies have lots of different point solutions. And when you're trying to investigate what's going on and where did the threat originate from, how that elevation and all of those type of things, potentially you then have to pivot across multiple different platforms of services. And that just adds more time and complexity. And this is where the MDR comes into play. So it's trying to make sense of all of these things. So as much as we have a lot of automation, we have a lot of investigative capability, having the managed detection and response gives you the human layer. So we're taking all of those logs, we're taking all the signals, we're taking all of those things together. But potentially it's only when you add the human layer and that ability to investigate, to look at the indicators of compromise, see where the threats came from, where it originated to, what we're seeing, have we seen this before? Is this the start of a campaign, those type of things? That's where we have the human layer. So that in essence is the difference between EDR, XDR and MDR. And I know as we go through, Rob will kind of bring it to life a little bit with how this all kind of interplays with each other. So hopefully that kind of answers the initial question, is what is the difference? And as I said, we love our acronyms, don't we?
Every day is a school day. Thank you, Sarah. That has made it perfectly clear. We can all go home now. Brilliant. Okay, Adam, we heard it from Sarah there, the differences between all of these acronyms. So for you, in your previous roles and your current role, what are some of the challenges that you've seen facing you for this challenge of having to correlate all of this data and do something with it?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So always a good pleasure to be back at InfoSec, although it's not just around the corner like it used to be when I wasn't at Met. I think for me, there's been three primary challenges which have really led to an XDR solution. That's certainly something that I was championing at the Met and have kind of gone on to do in my more recent roles. The first one is one of the things that Sarah touched on, which is so that threat visibility. So certainly what we find is that if you look at organised criminal groups, kind of hostile state actors and some of those other kind of high value players, the threat that you're facing isn't limited to a single component, and therefore anything where you're trying to get a point solution to respond to it ends up being able to only respond to a certain set of signals or characteristics. And effectively you kind of miss the bigger picture, and therefore whilst you're busy trying to do containment in one area, you're busy losing another effectively. So that's that kind of first piece around giving you that kind of visibility and transparency into your environment. I think the second key concern is just around speed of response. So as technology and tooling has kind of overtaken a lot of the kind of existing mechanisms and tactics that are around, human response is just unable to keep up with that emerging threat. So actually one of the things you need to be able to respond to is the threat anywhere it occurs, and you effectively need whatever layer or security control or component is closest to it to be able to start taking that action, but also to kind of coordinate and orchestrate those signals. They go out to other services, they can take preparatory work in case that threat has already started to spread. The third thing for me, actually, which is rather presents itself as an opportunity as much as a threat, is that we're always looking for teachable moments. So you're kind of looking for how you can build your resilience, even as part of that response exercise when you're dealing with it. And actually, one of the things that XDR really gives you is that richness of information that you can give to end users, engineering teams, the ops function, and kind of bringing those pieces out of the kind of security function itself to kind of support the entire organization, and absolutely be able to drive through those, how you respond and how you improve, not only now, but for future occurrences. And I think the unifying factor all of those things is this is all about having the context of the threat, the context of the emergent risk and what you can actually do about it, and giving you that enriched picture, which gives you a much better informed approach where you can actually choose to take appropriate responsive action, as opposed to some of the kind of knee-jerk kind of service denial stuff you can see previously. Because occasionally what you find is those classic lock it down, put it into isolation actually achieves what your attacker was after, which is cutting you off from your own resources.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Adam. That's really helpful. Thank you. Rob, welcome to the panel once again. Tell us a little bit about the way that you view the world of XDR, and how does it actually work in practice on the side of the fence as a service provider?
Sure. So I'll bring another acronym in first, which is SOC, Security Operations Center. So we're a SOC business, and any good SOC should be doing MDR. They should be doing managed detect and response in the SOC. Not really separate things, but really the same thing. And any SOC, any good SOC should be trying to use XDR or using XDR, as in the concepts of XDR. So should have network traffic analysis, excuse me, should have logs, should have EDR integration, should have data from cloud systems that people are using, should have good asset data, should have context, and should have automation, and should be focusing on instant response and orchestrating responses. So that's where we come into it, is that we think that's what a SOC should be doing, and XDR should be a fundamental thing that's used by a SOC, and the goal should be proactive instant response. And that means that the position is that you're detecting and responding to events or cyber attacks before they become major incidents. And that's how we look at the whole picture.
Rob, it sounds really simple and sensible. Is it easy to achieve?
No, because there's too many aggregated products, technologies. So the challenge is trying to do it seamlessly and quickly across different technologies. So an XDR vendor will want you to buy all their technology that all integrates really well, but that can cause issues with things like tie-in, vendor tie-in. It means you might have to replace lots of stuff you've already got, so the time to do it might take ages. So there might be challenges to doing that, and there are challenges to deploying new technology. Particularly if it's going to be an auto respond mode in some way, because it might break something. And I guess where we always look to add value is to provide the 24/7 expert people that can help them get these things done, and help listen and look at these alerts and act on them with a bit of human context. Because I think trying to get it all to work, trying to deploy everything, turn it all on in auto mode could create a lot of carnage for a lot of organizations.
Mm, absolutely. And when I think about the organizations that, different sizes and shapes, obviously there's a limit to the amount of resource that security functions can dedicate to to doing all of that work. And so I think it's important to be flexible in your approach, and don't assume that you can do it all yourself from day one, because I think that would be that'd be a terrible idea, wouldn't it?
Yeah, we certainly think that that's the case, and we always look to augment current teams in terms of staff and technology. And the way we position it is that we're not precious about what technology they're using, as long as we can integrate it and automate it into the SOC. Yeah. And the point is trying to make an effective security operation together using technology that fulfills the bits of an XDR service.
Okay, brilliant. So Adam mentioned something about insight, and I think that's really important. Is it? There's a huge amount of capability there now. We've seen the last 18 months digital transformation taking off like we've never seen it before. Many organizations are adopting digital service where they may not have selected them before, or even adopted cloud services where they may not have done so before. And so the insight that we need is now possibly more fragmented than it ever was, but it's still so important, right?
Oh, 100%, 100%. And I think what we were relying on here, as we were sort of saying, is being able to block known threats. So known threats comes through threat intelligence. So if I just kind of put that into a bit of perspective, so every single day Microsoft collects and processes and analyzes over 8 trillion signals. So that's coming through the endpoints, it's coming through the cloud, it's coming through search engines, and you're trying to make sense of all of these things. And that comes with behavior analytics, it's machine learning, it's all of those things. And that goes into a big feedback loop, as Rob was sort of saying, into that technology layer. And it's really then trying to sort of say where those known threats are, can you automatically build in and block those known threats? But as we sort of know, with regards to the threat landscape and how the attackers are continuing to evolve, and also they're learning and they understand our defenses. So they're understanding where the weaknesses are, the vulnerabilities. And as we know, they'll use any which way in, and they're not particularly bothered, let's be honest, about how they get in. So it could be, as we said, credential theft, compromised endpoints, it can be vulnerabilities in servers, it could be a myriad of things. And that's the reality of what we're trying to deal with. So potentially we're always playing catch up to a certain extent. And then the threat intelligence and the degree of intelligence, not just from someone like Microsoft, but obviously the multiple other threat companies and vendors and all that kind of thing. And we're all working together. But it really, what we're trying to do is, if we assume compromise, that's really the key. And if we assume compromise at any point in that network, any point in the estate, it could be from an on-prem, it's cloud, it's multi-cloud, multiple different devices and all sorts of things, then it's about our ability to detect all those anomalies. And as Rob was sort of saying, is we then have to be able to track and trace, assuming we've seen anomaly, assuming we've got compromise, then what? And if you're having to spend time looking at disparate tools and technologies, and I think one of the things that we identify is sometimes you have gaps in visibility, sometimes you have duplication, and sometimes you'll have technology that cross over each other as well. So it's actually very difficult to be able to go across multiple point solutions, hence the value of the XDR and actually being able to bring all of that into play and correlate all of those things. And that's why the human element is actually so important. The technology will go so far, but as we sort of said, then bringing in the human element of the correlation, making sense of what's going on. Is this new? Is it different? Is it campaign? Are we targeted? All of those sort of things are so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Adam, just on that point then, so we've got a proliferation of IT services, we've got an ever-changing threat landscape, and ultimately we need to make some sensible and intelligent decisions about our purchases and our architecture in some cases. So how do we advise businesses and customers on how they can make those intelligence decisions at the point that they adopt new digital technology?
Well, obviously the answer is it depends, because it always is. But I think there's no replacement for understanding your landscape, understanding your environment and what you've got. I tend to refer to kind of the jigsaw analogy, so understanding the kind of coverage that you've got from the components you've already got in play and where your gaps might be. And it's absolutely essential. I think it's when you do a proper kind of risk assessment or set of threat modeling to really understand the likely risks you'll face, because you kind of have to know what you're looking for. And I think part of the problem, and that kind of Sarah's alluded to, is so use of compromise compromised credentials, a compromised device on an otherwise normal user session, or malicious user behavior can be quite hard to distinguish from legitimate user behavior. So actually you have to kind of understand what you're looking for to understand what to bring to people's attention. The real goal for me around kind of the automation around a lot of that is to kind of build up a case and build up a set of intelligence for an actual person to process. But once you start to be able to automate the response to those known threats, you do kind of noise limitation or demand reduction. That means your very precious kind of human resources, because they are your greatest asset in this space, aren't subject to alert fatigue and aren't doing some of that other piece. They can actually get into the proper, genuine investigative work around understanding, you know, where this might be something more serious, or actually understanding the impact and the consequences of it. And again, those people are also really valuable in understanding your defenses and understanding the space, in doing that kind of threat hunting within the environment, because it can be harder to work out what you've got missing than what you've got, especially if you've got a lot of quite noisy tools. You're generating these huge amounts of alert, is you'll see a huge amount of data coming out of it. And actually quite often the most important thing is realizing the data stream or the data source that you don't have. And actually spotting that amidst the noise can be really difficult. It's a classic, you know, can't see the wood for the trees problem. Is you kind of go, I've got all of these data, I've got all of these logs. You go, that's fantastic. What happens when this happens? And people go, I wouldn't have any visibility of that. You go, that's your investment. Your investment is the question that you can't answer, that you think is a realistic problem for you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And Rob, how much complexity does all of this data add? I mean, Sarah talked about the amount of events that are going through the Microsoft services, and Adam talked about the uniqueness of each individual customer and different infrastructures. How much of a challenge does that pose to operating a SOC, or is it just a matter of taking off what you can chew first of all and then continuing to evolve and learn, as Adam mentioned earlier?
Sure, yeah, a bit of both. It's always sensible to start with a maturity plan and grow your maturity of investments in things like SOC or things like cyber technology. But in general, the SOC want lots of data, so they want lots of logs, turn lots of things on. A SOC will never want less data. So, you know, in terms of that, a good SOC wants lots of data. So they're not really bothered by the data. It's the technology that might become expensive in that scenario that you've got to worry about, I guess. Turning too much stuff on and driving up too much of a bill is an issue, sure. But in terms of analyzing the data, there's loads of great tools to do that. You know, there's loads of ways of doing it, but it's having the humans to interpret it that we think is the hardest bit in that picture. Same with XDR, there's loads of great technologies. It doesn't matter to us what EDR the customer's using, really. As long as they're using an EDR, and as I was talking previously, that often most cyber attacks do set off signals from existing deployed technology, whether it's firewalls or AV or EDR somewhere. It's just that no one's there looking at them. And that's the most frustrating thing to see, isn't it? That you have something in play and it did send an alert and no one looked at it and responded to it. And most attacks these days, the ransomware we see is set to go at 2 AM on Saturday morning, if it's UK, because they know no one's going to be around. They've had access for weeks and weeks, but they're going to trigger all the encryption and nasty stuff to run at 2 AM on a Saturday, because they know the IT is not around, and, you know. So I guess that's, for us, it's like there's lots of technology out there, which is great, but take a roadmap view. You know, you want to have these products, but you don't necessarily need them all at once. You may have them already, they're just maybe not used properly. There may be a configuration you can apply to your cloud to make it work better and log things better, and also evaluate what you've currently purchased and what your current licenses provide. Because often we see people don't realize the value in the license they've bought or subscription they've bought, and they're using a little bit of it. And it's like, well, hang on, you could use this, this, and this. Therefore, you don't need any more products. So there's loads of things you can start off with that might not cost you anything, that are just configuration or using something you're not using, and then create a roadmap over a quarter, over 6 months, or over a year to improve your cyber posture.
Okay, and so for an organisation that's listening to this, then Rob, that really feels as though they might have a gap and really would like some monitoring, what's the best way for them to start assessing? You know, what's their use case is what I'm trying to say. You know, how do we start to define what that is so that you can understand that and therefore respond by saying, you know, start with this small bit here, then gradually improve your maturity in this way?
I think it does, as Adam said, it does depend on the maturity of the organisation, but it always starts with, you know, what are the assets? What are the things you're trying to protect? What are the key things to your business? What keys can you not afford to lose? You know, which bits can't stop functioning, and try and get them to think about the business and what things rely on things that could be impacted by cyber. and the obvious ones like reputation. But for most organizations, they want to do something or sell something, so disrupting that process will be critical. So once you've got an idea about what it is they're doing and they want to keep doing what's valuable to them, you can then think about how you might want to defend that. So you ask some questions such as, in an audit process, you go, where are these things? Do you use these cloud services? Is it on-prem? Where is it? Who looks after it? And then what security controls do you have already? We can use that information to quite quickly understand how well you can defend an organization. And then it's about creating a maturity plan or a roadmap to sort of say, well, okay, you're most worried about this data, its current protection is this, but it could be upgraded to this, and what that would be. And trying to articulate a long-term continuous plan for cyber as well. So that means that they've got to take responsibility for it, which is the first thing. Like, even though they might outsource the problem to us, someone in the organization has to take responsibility for cyber. And if there isn't somebody around that does that, that needs to be solved. And it is every organization should take it seriously. People sort of say, oh, it won't affect us. As Sarah says, assume breach, that's where to start. If you haven't been breached already, maybe you just don't know it. But if you think like that, even if you haven't, it's way more healthy. Plan for the worst, but hope for the best. But as long as you're planning for the worst and putting things in place and doing it sensibly and thinking about it as a long-term journey, not a silver bullet thing, like you're not going to solve cyber by buying something. It's going to be a program that takes time and investment over time.
So Rob, I've witnessed myself a couple of ransomware incidents, and I've seen those negotiations with organised criminal groups, and I've seen organisations on their knees. I'm sure many of us have. Can you maybe just walk us through an example of a ransomware incident from the view of the SOC, and what's so important in terms of the timeline, the data sources, and every other element that it makes up that response as being an effective one?
Sure. So we'll take a reactive incident response scenario first. Almost, what would happen if you didn't do things properly and the incident occurred? How would you backtrack? And then I'll try and say later on how you could proactively not have that situation in the first place. But so you imagine a typical ransomware attack. So the scenario may be they've compromised the network firewalls or the VPN. So it might not be an endpoint attack at all. Therefore, you've not got EDR data, have you? Because a physical box in somewhere has been compromised, and that has an AD radius account that's hard-coded. Happens to be a domain admin, they've got that, and now they've got domain admin. Pretty easy stuff. You don't know they've got domain admin, so now they're just creating other admins or doing other things as admins. Okay, that's one scenario. But they may also then think, okay, well, let's just work out what other systems you have and find you've got a cloud environment, and they may then wait for some credentials to be stolen for that cloud environment because they probably don't match the domain environment. But they may be sitting there trying to catch someone administrating some cloud system to see if they can catch something, maybe setting up a new user, provisioning, so they can get accounts to the cloud maybe, or Salesforce or CRMs, whatever important systems they're after. Ransomware is not just about encrypting hard disks, it's about stealing stuff you need to do your business. And they'll sit around and look for you using these tools and go, oh, if we can get access to this system, they can't pay anybody. That's going to be inconvenient for them. Therefore, they'll probably pay a ransom to get that system back. So basically, in the first instance, then, where the domain the VPN's compromised, you probably want to be doing external vulnerability scanning to know that you've got a vulnerable VPN device, and you probably want to do some network traffic analysis to see who's been accessing it and who's been compromising it. So that's where the network traffic analysis or NDR might come in. So we'd always want to look at any internet connected gateways and look at traffic in and out. So we can look at things and say, oh, hang on a minute, we can see an exploit. So we've got IDS seeing an exploit, we've got logs from the box itself, the firewall, and then we might be able to detect that exploit, might we, that something's happened, and then maybe they're trying to SSH reverse shell from the firewall to get credentials back, and that stuff is detectable. So there's your network bit, but say they've done a normal phishing attack and they compromise an endpoint, what we generally see is an EDR message, okay, not an AV, not a virus at this stage, but something has tried to run something, a suspicious PowerShell commandlet or a macro, it could be anything, couldn't it? And that's the bit that often gets missed without a SOC, because someone misses it, because it's not stopped it, it's just telling you something odd's happening. The SOC should be going to that user and going, are you running PowerShell? Why are you running this weird PowerShell? You don't normally run PowerShell. But if they're not there, then the PowerShell runs and it fails and logs are generated. But if that user or the hacker gets through they'll start to clear the logs, won't they? Clear all the logs, clear the audit logs, start to hide the tracks, and then they'll go for lateral movement. Again, that will cross the network. So if you've got network traffic analysis or flow data or some sort of logs from your firewalls, you might see traversal. So if you imagine you've come in on a Monday and everything's off, you haven't got your domain admin credentials anymore. Yeah, what are you going to do? You need the logs connected off the boxes into a logging something, don't you? You need the EDR ideally still running, or at least the EDR data collected somewhere. You need network traffic analysis for a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 days. And you need all those things in a point of an incident, don't you? And ideally, if you want to do that a bit more sensibly, I think of the real way this should have worked is that, say the EDR has sent us a message to say a suspicious PowerShell command that's being ran. In a good, effective MDR-based partnership with an organization, we could be doing what we call SOC think time countermeasures. Maybe we could isolate that machine for 10 minutes from the network, leave Teams and Outlook running, but have a conversation with the user saying, are you running PowerShell? Did you click a link a minute ago? We want to pivot straight from that machine to any email traffic to and from it. What was the user clicking on? Were they running Outlook? Were they doing stuff? Going to cloud data? But ideally, we'd be interacting with that first PowerShell strange EDR message. And when it comes to things like the compromised firewall, we should be prioritizing externally facing vulnerabilities, right? That could lead to compromise, high CVSS scoring vulnerabilities. Your SOC should be vulnerability scanning all your endpoints, all your exposed internet IP addresses, domain names, URLs, looking for easy things. Another good example of that is exposed RDP creds. How many times does they get compromised? Or exposed SSH in the cloud? Do you really need to have it open for everybody? You can proactively sort this out. Conditional access, there's loads of different ways of doing this stuff, but organizations generally sort of miss these things. And sometimes supply chain attacks happen like that too, where you find that suppliers open things up or make a change temporarily to do something and don't change it back. Typically that's firewalls with admin access open to the internet temporarily, and no such thing as more permanent than temporary, is there, with this kind of thing. Or misconfigured rule sets and things like that. There's loads of things you can practically do to minimize this, but I guess to round it all up, there's lots of different ways things can happen. It could be start in the cloud, it could start on the firewall, it could start on the endpoint, it could be all these things. But when you've got XDR deployed, you've got ways of detecting and responding that doesn't rely on any one thing, because any of your one things may get broken during the attack. So you're really trying to cover the whole system with eyes on. And that's probably, that's my explanation, Mark.
Brilliant. I mean, just listening to that, Rob, it makes me think, back to the days when we had worms and everything was just automated. You could predict the behavior, but what you're talking about there are human beings, and we talked about it earlier, human beings finding different things. And that's exactly why I got to it depends to the questions I answered, because it does depend. Every organization is unique, and the attackers will just go and find whatever they can. And it's almost like we're chasing shadows. And you cannot chase shadows unless you've got coverage of the data to understand where they are going or where they have been. So that's really important. So I guess wrapping up then, Sarah, first of all, from you hearing that, how can organizations be more proactive about starting that journey? It's obviously quite complex. It can be quite complex depending on what you've got. But what are some of the more fundamental things and proactive things that people can be doing?
Yeah, just picking up on what Rob was saying there. So if we're thinking about getting access in and that elevation of privilege, so really we have to embrace the principle of least privileged. As we sort of said, is not having open-ended access rights, just having a principle just in time and just enough access. So if that change is only supposed to take 5 minutes, you only have 5 minutes access and it's closed down. So even if that account was compromised, they're kind of stuck with what they can do. The second point then is preventing that lateral movement, is having network and infrastructure segmentation as well, particularly between your on-prem and cloud environments. So again, even if you were compromised, they're kind of, again, they're boxed in with how far they can go and what they can do. And kind of the third point really, when we talk about that vulnerability and that vulnerability scanning, so that scanning and looking for where those unpatched, unsupported servers and network points are is important for you to do, because the attackers are doing the exact same thing. They're looking for the vulnerable entry points. They're looking for what isn't being monitored. And they will run the same scans in technology as well to see what scans you're doing at the same time. So I think it's really looking at, again, what's exposed to the internet. Can you reduce that technical debt by, even if you can't upgrade or some of these out of support or unpatched services, can you box them in with VPN access, those type of things. So it's really ultimately it's about slowing down the pace of attack and trying to disrupt their return of investment as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. Adam, same question to you. How can organisations proactively help go on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you really do need to understand those assets and those services. And I think part of that proactive and kind of pragmatic element is about engaging with the teams that are responsible for those to help them understand some of those weaknesses and what they can do to improve them, because none of those teams want their services offline or compromised either. And actually, by working with them and addressing some of those problems upstream, you can prevent yourself having to respond so much. I think it's absolutely key around that, which is, you should vigorously defend your identity stores. I mean, certainly in that kind of least privilege model, those are absolutely your crown jewels and your assets, and that should have absolutely layered and ringed defenses around them. And if you don't, that's always an area to reinforce. But yeah, absolutely. It's about that proactive engagement and kind of helping people understand that landscape. And one of the things you can really drive in with automation and making better use of your existing tools is your people cannot proactively engage with those other units in the kind of open and constructive way they want to, if they're so busy firefighting and responding to some of those kind of noisy alerts and tools. So actually, by throttling your own demand, you free yourself up the capacity to help and support other people, because those other areas aren't well resourced either. And effectively being able to actively engage with them and help them address concerns in their area, you'll get a much better response and start to break down some of those barriers that the security function can often face as well.
Thank you, Adam. And Rob, final comment from yourself then.
Yeah, sure. So thank you everyone for talking about XDR today. I hope we've demystified some of it, talked about some of the great advantages that XDR provides. I guess from our perspective, the final thing for me is to think about how you utilize technology like that to create an effective security operation. And that's what we believe is the most important part. It's connecting the people 24/7 who've got the skills and expertise to get the most out of the technology that you're procuring and deploying, or help you procure and deploy it as well, clearly. But we think that, just as important as buying the technology is thinking about how you're going to maintain, manage it, and run a 24/7 operation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. Well, one final piece of wisdom for me, just to add to that amazing panel session there. Just before you start on that journey, just go and check your backups and make sure that they're taken and they work, because Sarah said it earlier, assume that you will get compromised and you'll be okay. Guys, thank you very much, Sarah, Rob, Adam, really, really appreciate it. Everybody, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, by all means, get in touch with us, and hope to see you soon.